The rumble of motorcycle engines slowly faded as the riders pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Blue Sky Diner, a small roadside spot just off Highway 101. The morning sun glinted off chrome and polished black leather as 15 members of the Black Urban Riders Coalition, known as BURC by locals, removed their helmets and stretched road-stiff muscles. "Man, I need some coffee, something fierce," said the club president, a tall man with salt and pepper beard and kind eyes that had seen plenty in his 50-some years. The rest of the crew nodded in agreement. They'd been on the road since dawn, part of their annual charity ride raising money for youth programs in underserved neighborhoods. The diner looked like something from another time, blue paint peeling slightly at the corners, neon sign buzzing, and the smell of bacon and pancakes wafting through the open door. Perfect for hungry riders. "Hope they got enough food for all of us," laughed one of the younger members, patting his stomach. He wore the club's emblem proudly on his back. A black motorcycle with a rising sun behind it, the words "Ride with Purpose" curved above. As they filed in, the usual quick hush fell over the diner. The BURC members were used to it. 15 black motorcyclists in matching leather vests tended to turn heads, especially in small towns. But something felt different this time. The silence had an edge to it, and folks weren't just looking at them. The club treasurer noticed it first. He nudged the president and nodded toward the corner booth. There, hunched over a laptop and coffee mug, sat one of the most recognizable faces in America, the billionaire tech CEO, Elon Musk. And perched right on his head was a bright red MAGA hat. "Well, I'll be," whispered one rider, a retired school teacher who'd helped start the club's mentorship program. "What are the odds?" The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a name tag reading Flo, approached cautiously. "Table for 15? She asked, glancing between the bikers and the billionaire, clearly uncertain about the situation unfolding in her diner. "Yes, ma'am," answered the president politely. "Preferably somewhere we can all sit together." As they followed Flo to a section of pushed-together tables, the tech billionaire looked up briefly from his screen. For just a second, his eyes met the club president's. Neither man nodded or smiled. Just a moment of recognition before both looked away. The other diners, a mix of locals and travelers, watched the scene with obvious tension. An elderly couple in the booth beside Musk gathered their things and paid quickly, scurrying out with worried glances. A trucker at the counter turned completely around on his stool, not even pretending not to stare. "You think he recognized the club?" asked the vice president, a woman who'd started riding after retiring from the military. Everyone in the BURC knew their reputation went beyond their charity work. They'd been vocal about social justice issues, participated in protests, and frequently spoke out about policies they believed harmed their communities, including some supported by the very hat the billionaire was wearing. "Oh, he knows who we are," replied the president quietly, studying his menu without really seeing it. "Question is, what do we do about it?" The waitress returned with waters and took their orders, her pen scratching quickly across her pad as 15 hungry riders called out their breakfast choices. Through it all, the tech CEO kept typing, occasionally sipping his coffee, seemingly oblivious to the tension filling the small diner like smoke. But the BURC members noticed how his fingers had slowed on the keyboard, how his eyes occasionally flicked in their direction. He wasn't as unaware as he pretended to be. "So," said the road captain, leaning in so only the club members could hear, "are we just going to eat our breakfast and pretend he's not sitting there? Or are we going to say something?" The question hung in the air between them as the ceiling fans slowly turned above, pushing around the scent of coffee and the weight of a decision that would change everything that came after. Plates of steaming eggs, bacon, and pancakes arrived at the bikers' table, but nobody touched their food. All 15 members of the Black Urban Riders Coalition sat leaning in, voices low but intense. Every few seconds, someone would glance toward the corner booth where the tech billionaire continued typing away beneath his red hat. "I don't see why we should say anything to him," said the club treasurer, adjusting his glasses. "We came here to eat, not start trouble." The vice president shook his head, pushing his plate away. "That man's robots took my job 2 years ago. 30 years at that plant, then suddenly they don't need people anymore." His hands curled into fists on the table. 200 families in my neighborhood hurt because of his innovation, and now he sits there wearing that hat like it's nothing. A younger rider, only 3 years in the club, nodded. It's not just the job thing. That hat stands for policies that have our communities struggling. Healthcare we can't afford, schools falling apart, police that. We know, brother, the road captain cut in, patting his shoulder. We all know. The woman who handled the club's social media presence sipped her coffee. I say we ignore him. Anything else just gives him attention he doesn't deserve. A heavy silence fell over the table. The president watched his friends, seeing the mix of anger, hesitation, and determination on their faces. They were good people, mechanics, teachers, nurses, retired military, who spent weekends mentoring kids and rebuilding community centers. They weren't looking for confrontation, but they weren't the type to stay silent either. Across the diner, the billionaire closed his laptop and signaled for his check. He might be leaving soon. Remember why we started this club, said one of the oldest members, his voice gravelly from years of riding into headwinds. To change perceptions. To show that we're more than what people assume when they see a group of black bikers. He pointed with his fork toward the corner booth. Right now, he's assuming we're not worth his time. And we're assuming we know everything about him because of a hat. The president nodded slowly. Maybe that's the biggest problem these days. Everybody thinking they already know everything about everybody else. Flo, the waitress, hurried past their table, refilling coffee cups with a shaky hand. She was clearly nervous about the tension building in her diner. Other customers kept stealing glances, some openly recording with their phones. The vice president's face softened as he looked at the waitress. Last thing we want is to make trouble for this place or get ourselves on the evening news for the wrong reasons. So what do we do? Asked the youngest member, barely 25 and new to the group. The tech CEO had paid his bill but remained seated, now scrolling through his phone. The red hat seemed brighter somehow under the diner's fluorescent lights. I think, said the president carefully, we should talk to him. Not confront. Talk. He looked around the table. We've got 15 different stories at this table about how his companies and the politics of that hat have affected our lives. Maybe he's never actually heard those stories from real people. And if he doesn't want to hear them? Asked the treasurer. The president shrugged. Then we tried. But at least we didn't judge him without giving him a chance to be more than what we assumed. Murmurs of agreement and a few grumbles of doubt circled the table. The food was getting cold, but no one was eating anyway. All in favor? Asked the president. One by one, hands raised. Not all at once, and a few only halfway, but eventually all 15 members agreed. All right then, said the president, sliding his chair back. I'll go first. You'll give me a few minutes before coming over. Don't want to make him feel surrounded. He stood, straightened his leather vest, and took a deep breath. 15 pairs of eyes watched as he turned and began walking toward the corner booth, toward a conversation no one in the diner had expected when the morning began. The walk across the diner felt longer than it should have. Each step the club president took seemed to amplify the silence that had fallen over the blue sky diner. Forks stopped mid-air. Coffee cups hovered near lips. Even the sizzling from the kitchen seemed to quiet down. He could feel eyes on his back, his club members watching with a mix of support and concern, the other customers probably expecting the worst. His leather vest suddenly felt heavier, the club's emblem like a target between his shoulder blades. The tech billionaire looked up from his phone as the biker approached, his expression changing from surprise to something more guarded. He slipped the phone into his jacket pocket and straightened slightly. The red hat seemed almost defiant now. Excuse me, the president said, his deep voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. Hope I'm not interrupting anything important. The billionaire's eyebrow raised slightly. Just checking stock prices, nothing that can't wait. His voice was different than it sounded on TV, softer, less rehearsed. For a moment, they just looked at each other, two men from worlds that couldn't be further apart. One in a crisp button-down shirt worth more than most people's monthly rent, the other in road-worn leather that had seen thousands of miles of highway. I'm the president of the Black Urban Riders Coalition, he said, gesturing toward his club. We couldn't help but notice you sitting here. Hard to miss 15 motorcycles pulling up, the billionaire replied with the hint of a smile. Nice bikes. Vintage Harleys in the mix? The question caught the president off guard. He hadn't expected to talk about motorcycles. Yeah, few of us restore the classics. Mine's a '98 Road King, nothing special. Solid machine, the billionaire nodded. What can I do for you? Autograph? Photo? The president's jaw tightened slightly. Actually, we were hoping we might have a conversation with you. My friends and I, we have some questions. Things we've been wondering about for a while. The diner seemed to collectively hold its breath. A fork clattered to the floor somewhere, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the silence. The billionaire glanced at the red hat sitting on the table beside him, then back at the biker. Understanding flickered in his eyes. About this, he asked, tapping the hat. That and other things, the president replied. Your companies, the future you're building, how it affects folks like us. The tech CEO studied him for a long moment. His fingers drummed against the table as he considered the request. The president braced himself for a dismissal, for security to be called, for the moment to sour. You know, the billionaire said finally, most people just tweet angry things at me, or write think pieces about what they assume I believe. He gestured to the empty seats at his booth. Honestly, a real conversation would make a nice change. The president blinked, surprised by the easy acceptance. He glanced back at his friends, who were watching with expressions ranging from shock to cautious optimism. He gave them a small nod, and several started to stand. Hold up, the billionaire said, raising a hand. 15 on 1 feels a bit intimidating even for me. How about you choose a few representatives? We can pull up another table if needed. The president nodded. That's fair. He turned and walked back to his group, feeling the weight of the moment. Whatever happened next could go so many different ways. He's willing to talk, he told them quietly. But not all of us at once. Who wants to join me? Hands raised immediately. The vice president who'd lost his job. The social media manager with strong opinions about the hat. The older member who'd spoken about changing perceptions. And the youngest rider, eyes wide with the possibility of this unexpected encounter. The rest of you, enjoy your breakfast, the president said. We'll represent the club the best we can. As the 5 bikers made their way across the diner, the billionaire motioned to Flo. Could we get some fresh coffee over here? And maybe push up another table, he asked. Flo nodded, still looking nervous but now with a hint of curiosity. The tech CEO stood as the bikers approached, extending his hand to the president. Let's start over. I'm Elon. I know who you are, the president said, taking the offered hand. The question is, do you know who we are? Do I know who you are? The billionaire repeated the question, looking thoughtfully at the 5 bikers now seated around his expanded table. I know you're the Black Urban Riders Coalition. I've seen news coverage of your charity rides and mentorship programs. The vice president leaned forward, surprise evident on his face. You've heard of us. I make it my business to know what's happening in communities where my companies operate, the tech CEO replied, taking a sip of the fresh coffee Flo had brought over. Your work with at-risk youth is impressive. The coding boot camps especially. The youngest club member exchanged glances with the others. This wasn't starting the way any of them had expected. The social media manager tapped a finger on the red hat that now sat on the edge of the table. Then you must also know many of us have been critical of what this represents. A small smile crossed the billionaire's face. That's why I wear it sometimes. Gets people talking. He leaned back in his seat. But I'm more interested in hearing your specific concerns than debating symbolism. You mentioned questions. The president nodded, gathering his thoughts. My friend here, he said, gesturing to the vice president, worked at the Autoflex manufacturing plant for 30 years before your robots replaced him and 200 others. The vice president's voice was steady but edged with old anger. 30 years. Started on the line at 19. Worked my way up to floor supervisor. Had 15 people under me. Then your company buys the plant, and suddenly we're all obsolete. He made air quotes around the word. No warning, just a pink slip and a handshake. The billionaire didn't look away from the hard stare. The Fremont acquisition. 2019, right? You remember it, the vice president said, sounding slightly surprised. I remember all of them. The tech CEO's face grew serious. What happened to you after? The vice president hadn't expected that question. Tried to find similar work. Too old to start over, too young to retire. Burned through savings. Almost lost my house. His voice softened. The club helped me out. Got me work at a buddy's repair shop. I'm okay now, but many others weren't so lucky. The diner had grown quieter as other customers tried to listen in. Flo hovered nearby, refilling coffee cups as an excuse to hear the conversation. Technology displacement isn't new, the billionaire said, his fingers laced around his mug. But the pace is accelerating, I won't deny that. That's not good enough, the social media manager cut in. You can't just shrug and say progress happens when real people suffer. Instead of becoming defensive, the tech CEO nodded. You're right. The unexpected agreement caught them off guard. The transition programs we implemented were inadequate, he continued. We focused on efficiency gains without sufficient attention to human costs. He pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, then set it face down. That's on me. The oldest biker, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. Our community center in Oak Park closed last year. Budget cuts. That center had after-school programs, keeping kids off streets, job training for parents, health screenings. Now it's just an empty building while city officials argue about funding. Meanwhile, added the youngest member, finding his courage, your rocket launches cost what? Hundreds of millions each. The president watched carefully, expecting the billionaire to shut down the conversation. Instead, he seemed genuinely engaged, asking follow-up questions about the community center programs and taking notes on his phone. What would you do? The tech CEO asked suddenly, looking at each of them. If you had my resources, my companies, how would you handle automation differently? The question hung in the air for a moment before the vice president answered. Respect experience. Those of us who'd been there 30 years, we could have helped train your techs, maintain the machines, instead of firing us, transition us. The social media manager added, invest in the communities you disrupt. Not just donations for tax write-offs, but real infrastructure. The billionaire typed more notes, nodding, go on. As their breakfast grew cold on the other table, the 5 bikers began sharing stories, personal experiences of technological change, economic hardship, and community resilience. And to everyone's surprise, especially their own, the man in the red hat was actually listening. 2 hours had passed since the bikers first approached the tech billionaire's table. Empty coffee cups and half-eaten toast cluttered the tabletop. Flo had long stopped pretending to clean nearby tables and now openly listened from behind the counter. The morning crowd had thinned, leaving just a few curious stragglers and the Blue Sky Diner staff watching this unlikely meeting unfold. Wait, back up, said the club president, leaning forward with genuine interest. You're saying your first computer was a hand-me-down Commodore 64? The billionaire nodded, a hint of nostalgia crossing his face. Dad thought it was junk. I taught myself basic on that thing, staying up until 3 in the morning when everyone was asleep. First program I ever sold was a game, made $500. No kidding, said the vice president, shaking his head with a grudging smile. My nephew's in your coding program at the high school. Kid won't stop talking about making games. The oldest rider chimed in. That's the problem with our neighborhood schools, though. Computers are ancient when they have them at all. My granddaughter's class shares 5 laptops between 30 kids. The billionaire frowned, making another note on his phone. That's unacceptable in 2024. The conversation had gradually shifted from confrontation to something resembling actual dialogue. Personal stories flowed back and forth across the table, the tech CEO describing sleeping in his car during his early startup days. The social media manager explaining how her mother walked 2 miles to work after bus routes were cut in their neighborhood. The youngest rider sharing his dreams of opening a tech repair shop for the community. What gets me, said the president, gesturing toward the window where their motorcycles gleamed in the midday sun, is that we're all talking about the same thing, just from different angles. You're developing electric vehicles to cut carbon emissions. We're trying to get reliable public transportation so folks don't have to choose between gas money and groceries. The billionaire nodded slowly. Different approaches to the same problems. But your approach gets billions in funding and media attention, the social media manager pointed out. Our approach gets ignored or criticized. Instead of dismissing her comment, the tech CEO surprised them again. You're right. The distribution of resources is wildly unbalanced. He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. Your community center programs, the ones that were cut. Tell me more about the educational components. The oldest rider's eyes lit up. That was my baby. Had coding classes for kids, basic electronics repair workshop, even a small fabrication lab with a 3D printer someone donated. Kids loved it. Had them building solar-powered phone chargers last summer. The billionaire sat up straighter. And this all shut down due to budget cuts. City Council said they couldn't justify the expense, the club president explained. Building's still there, just sitting empty. All that potential going to waste. The youngest member, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. What if we could reopen it, with better equipment? Maybe partner with tech companies for training programs. Something changed in the billionaire's expression, a spark of the same creativity that had built his empire. Not just partner. What if we reimagined the entire concept? Community-based innovation hubs with direct pipelines to jobs in tech, renewable energy, advanced manufacturing. The vice president looked skeptical. Sounds nice, but who pays for all that? Our neighborhood isn't exactly on your board's priority list. It could be, the tech CEO said simply. He pulled out a business card, plain white with just a phone number, and slid it across the table. My private line. Call me tomorrow. I think there's something here worth exploring. The 5 bikers exchanged glances, decades of disappointment and broken promises making them wary of hope. Why would you help us? The social media manager asked directly. What's in it for you? The billionaire glanced at the red hat, now pushed aside among the coffee cups. Because you were right about something. I've been disconnected from the real-world impact of my work. He looked around at their faces, and because proving people wrong about what's possible is kind of my thing. The club president picked up the card, turning it over in his fingers. This conversation isn't what any of us expected this morning. Best conversations rarely are, replied the billionaire with a small smile. So tomorrow? The president nodded, pocketing the card. Tomorrow. The old community center looked worse than the club president remembered. Peeling paint, broken windows covered with plywood, and graffiti tags marking abandoned walls. He stood on the cracked sidewalk with the vice president and social media manager, waiting and wondering if they had been fools to believe anything would come of yesterday's diner conversation. He's not coming, the social media manager said, checking her watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. It was 10:05 a.m. The billionaire had said 10 o'clock. Give it time, the president replied, though doubt had been gnawing at him since dawn. He barely slept, turning the possibilities over in his mind all night. Hope was a dangerous thing when you'd seen promises broken so many times before. A sleek black electric car turned the corner, moving almost silently down the street. It stopped in front of the community center, looking wildly out of place in the neighborhood where most vehicles were at least a decade old. The tech CEO stepped out, wearing jeans and a plain black t-shirt. No red hat today. He was accompanied by a woman carrying a tablet and a man with an architect's portfolio case. Sorry we're late, the billionaire said, extending his hand to the bikers. Traffic was worse than expected. The president shook his hand, relief washing over him. You actually came. I said I would. The billionaire gestured to his companions. This is my head of community development and our lead architect. I hope you don't mind I brought them along. The vice president crossed his arms. Depends on why they're here. The billionaire smiled. To listen. To learn. And hopefully to help us turn this building into something remarkable. For the next hour, they walked through the abandoned center, stepping over debris, pointing out what used to be here, what could be there. The architect sketched rapidly on a digital tablet as the bikers described their vision. The community developer asked detailed questions about neighborhood needs, existing programs, and local skills. The basement could be perfect for a fabrication lab, the tech CEO said, shining his phone flashlight across the spacious lower level. 3D printers, laser cutters, CNC machines, everything kids need to build and create. The social media manager nodded thoughtfully. But it needs to be more than just fancy equipment. Our community needs jobs, skills that lead to actual employment. Agreed, said the billionaire. What if we set up a direct pipeline? Training programs here that feed directly into internships at my companies. He turned to his community developer. We could implement that, right? She nodded. We've been looking to diversify our talent pipeline anyway. This could work. The vice president remained skeptical. And who maintains all this? Who pays the power bills? Who stops it? The billionaire looked him straight in the eye. You do. Your club. Your community. My foundation provides the initial investment, equipment, and training. We help set up sustainable funding. But this needs to be community-owned to succeed. The president felt a spark of excitement. You mean like a partnership, not a charity project? Exactly, the tech CEO replied. My companies need diverse talent and perspectives. Your community needs economic opportunities and resources. This isn't charity, it's mutually beneficial. They gathered in what used to be the center's main hall, where the architect had set up crude renderings on his tablet, showing what the space could become. Solar panels on the roof, modern classrooms, a computer lab, workshops for everything from coding to engineering. We're calling it Bridge the Gap, the billionaire explained. Because that's what we're doing, bridging gaps between technologies, communities, and opportunities. The social media manager leaned forward. And what about the politics? That hat you were wearing yesterday stands for things many in our community oppose. The room grew quiet. The question had been hanging in the air all morning. The billionaire nodded slowly. The hat was a conversation starter. And it worked, didn't it? Got us talking. He looked around at their faces. I believe in technological progress, in American innovation, in building things that matter. But I also believe we've left too many people behind. This project isn't about politics, it's about fixing that mistake. The three bikers exchanged glances, years of community organizing experience making them cautious even as hope grew. We need to discuss this with the full club, the president said finally. This affects everyone. Of course, the billionaire agreed. And I need board approval for the funding. He extended his hand. But are we agreed in principle? Should we move forward together? The president took his hand, feeling the weight of the moment. In principle. Let's see where this goes. 6 months flew by quicker than anyone expected. The old abandoned community center on Martin Luther King Boulevard got a complete makeover. Fresh paint covered the walls, new computers filled the classrooms, and a big solar panel array gleamed on the roof. Today was opening day. The morning sun shone bright as crowds gathered outside the new Bridge the Gap Technology Center. Kids from the neighborhood pressed their faces against the windows, eager to see the robots and 3D printers inside. Parents chatted excitedly about the free classes their children would soon attend. The club president stood nervously adjusting his leather vest. He never imagined he'd be standing shoulder to shoulder with one of the richest men in the world. Yet here they were, about to cut the ribbon together. You nervous? Asked the tech billionaire, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't wearing the red hat today. Nah, just thinking about how crazy life can be, the biker replied. 1 minute we're ready to walk out of that diner, the next we're changing lives together. When they cut the ribbon, the cheers were deafening. Local news cameras flashed. A reporter pushed forward, microphone extended. How did this unlikely partnership come about? The tech mogul looked at his new friend before answering. We talked instead of shouted. We listened instead of assuming. Simple as that. Inside, the center buzzed with energy. Young boys proudly showed their moms how to program simple robots. Teenage girls huddled around a solar panel display, asking tough questions that made the engineers sweat. In the corner, a group of older folks learned how to use computers to start small businesses. One of the bikers, a big man with gentle hands, helped a little girl build her first circuit board. I used to fix motorcycles, he told her. Now I'm learning about electric ones. Maybe you'll design them someday. Word spread fast. A month later, people from a town 3 hours away visited to see how they could copy the idea. Then a group from another state came. The center's success stories piled up: a high school dropout who got accepted to engineering school, a grandmother who started an online business, a young man who landed a job at the tech company's factory. What nobody knew until later was that a film student had been sitting in that diner 6 months ago. She captured the whole first meeting on her phone. When she posted the short documentary online, it exploded. People couldn't get enough of watching two seemingly opposite worlds find common ground. 3 more centers opened across the country by year's end. The tech billionaire put his money behind it, but it was the bikers who gave the program its heart. They understood what their communities needed. At the 1-year celebration, the club president looked out at a room filled with students, teachers, bikers, tech workers, and community members all talking and laughing together. "When we walked into that diner a year ago," he told the crowd, "we thought we knew exactly who that man in the red hat was, and he probably thought he knew exactly who we were too. We were all wrong. That's the lesson here." The tech billionaire nodded. "I've launched rockets and built electric cars, but this is different. This is about people connecting despite everything pushing them apart." A young boy raised his hand. "Are you guys really friends now?" The 2 men looked at each other and laughed. "Yeah," said the biker, "though he still can't ride a motorcycle worth a damn. And his coding is terrible," the billionaire shot back with a grin. As night fell, the unlikely friends sat on the center's roof, looking out over the city lights. Neither could have imagined this outcome when they'd first locked eyes across that diner. Sometimes the most powerful changes start with the simplest action, choosing to talk instead of walk away. The story of the bikers and the billionaire reminded people everywhere that beneath our labels and assumptions, we all want many of the same things: respect, understanding, and a chance to build something better together.